Good morning. The second reading today is Matthew 7, verses 24 to 29. The wise and foolish builders. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see you. My name's Murray. Some of you I have not met. New faces out there. Lovely to have you joining us today. Sorry, lots of things here. I need to do some housekeeping before we start. It's great to have you here. We're going to be sharing the Lord's Supper a little bit later in the service, just so you can be preparing for that. We'll do it a little bit differently today. Looking forward to eating and drinking, remembering Christ's death together. But for now, we're into our last bit of the Sermon on the Mount. It's been quite a journey. And we kind of get to the end of Jesus' teaching bit before we kind of get back into Jesus on the move. Looking forward to seeing Jesus and walking with him through the next few things we see in Matthew's Gospel. But speaking of adventures and going around a bit, I want to tell you about a time I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, quite a while ago now. My family were living in the Middle East, missionary families out there. We had the opportunity to visit the country of Oman. Not Amman, Oman, if you know where that is, on the edge of the Middle East, Arabian Gulf. And it's a place of real kind of rugged beauty. And one day we went out to do this thing we called wadi bashing. Have you ever heard that before? It sounds pretty violent. Don't worry, we're not hurting anyone. Sounds violent, but basically it's four-wheel driving out in a desert valley, and a desert valley in that part of the world is called a wadi. So wadi bashing out through the desert in some four-wheel drives. I do remember feeling like I'd been bashed after vibrating in this four-wheel drive for felt like hours. But you make it out into the wadi, into the desert valley, and occasionally we'd sort of see like little houses or shacks or little villages kind of perched up in the walls of the valley around us. A few people here and there, a couple of goats, some trees, not much. People kind of scratching out survival in this barren wilderness. But eventually, through this wilderness and dry place, we come to a waterhole, a bend in the valley, and there's just lovely kind of greenish water there. It was beautiful. Like, it was cool. There was little fish that would nibble your toes, that kind of thing. Refreshing and cool in the hot desert. Now, I can't remember exactly who was there. There was a few of us. There was a missionary conference that we were kind of there for. But I don't remember who it was, but one real highlight was suddenly, at one point, this person started diving off one of the cliff walls into the water. It was mainly like 6 or 8 feet up, not that high, but for little Murray, it's amazing, it's thrilling. And what's better, they asked if I wanted to learn how to do it too. I thought, oh, great. In hindsight, I can't remember if my mother was on this trip or not. The story may have ended there if she was, but she wasn't. I don't think she was. Anyway, but it looked a bit dangerous. But the person giving me instruction was very clear, was very careful. They said, aim for that bit, not that bit. The water's deep there. Hold your hands like that so you break the surface tension and don't break your head, So it gave me very clear instructions so that I'd be safe doing it. They demonstrated, they showed me, they taught me carefully. They said what would happen if I did the wrong thing, if I didn't listen to their instructions. It's a thrill, it's a rush, it's a bit scary, but good to know how important those instructions were. Now, maybe sitting there worried this story is going to go bad. Don't worry, it doesn't. Yeah, I did what I was told. I listened well. I was a good student. I trusted my teacher. I had a great afternoon of just diving into this beautiful water in this desert valley, following their instructions, avoiding the danger, sailing through the air, splashing into the water. It was amazing. I Googled this place. I was a kid, I don't remember where it was, but I found this picture and I thought maybe that was the rock I dived off. Maybe that's how amazing I looked, but I doubt it. I doubt it. Well, let's keep journeying. We're going to go northwest from Oman, head 3,000 kilometers away. There's a map there. And 2,000 years earlier, there we go, up to Galilee, by the Sea of Galilee, where we're joining Jesus and his disciples and the crowd as Jesus comes to his closing words of his epic sermon. And he's finishing up his warnings and his teachings. And those of you who were here last week, we heard a few of these kind of dire warnings. There's serious consequences of not listening to what Jesus says. Now, my diving instructor gave me consequences for ignoring what he said. Jesus here gives serious consequences for ignoring what he says too. It can sound a bit like scare tactics maybe. Is that what it is? Is he scaring us into something? I think he's using fear, but we've all been subject to scare tactics in the last little while leading up to the election. Various groups paint the dire consequences of electing their opponents. Environmental, economic, national security disasters round the corner if we ignore them. It's hard to know how to take these warnings, how serious we take them. They're obviously playing politics. Do we listen? It's hard to know for these kind of warnings, especially in election season. Time may tell. It's different though, say if you're in a bushfire or a flood, someone comes to you and says, it's time to evacuate, it's time to go. That's not scare tactics, right? To the best of their ability, their knowledge, it's time to get out, you're in danger. And you know that they might get it wrong, but they want your safety. They want to protect you and your property. I listen to my dive instructor, his warnings, instructions. We listen to emergency services, their warnings and instructions, because the consequences of not listening can be terrible. So kind of the question is, Jesus, what's he doing here? Is he throwing out some scare tactics to kind of boost his socio-political movement? Or are these warnings really, really worth listening to? He doesn't hold back, right? We kind of saw this last week. We'll see it again this week. Remember, if you were here last week, we heard Jesus talk about the narrow gate and the wide gate. This image of saying to get into the kingdom of God, to have life and peace and eternity, there's one way. It's narrow. It's kind of Jesus size, that narrow. Because he is the way, the only way. Jesus is the narrow way. The broad way is everything else except for Jesus, trusting in anything else. Jesus says there's a narrow way that leads to life, and I'm it. And there's a broad way that leads to death and destruction. It's a serious warning he gives. Only I give you that life. Listen to me. And again, last week, he then warns against the false teachers, and that's anyone who points to a different gate, apart from Jesus alone, towards the broad way. Jesus pronounces judgment on them. He warns them. He warns us not to listen. And last week, the chilling words for anyone who calls themselves a Christian and calls on Jesus' name. These words Jesus says, he says to his disciples even, it's not enough to call on my name. It's not even enough to do miracles and cast out demons in my name. It's not what you say that matters, it's living in the will of the Father. I'll read those words so they can sink in with their seriousness again. Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Gives you reason for pause, doesn't it? It's a stark warning. I don't think it's scare tactics to manipulate us. I think Jesus is putting out the truth, the fair warning. So what do? Jesus goes on with the words we just heard read before. Therefore, in the light of all this, therefore, everyone who hears my words and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. Jesus uses this kind of pretty clear image with a simple message. Put into practice Jesus' words. Don't just listen to the words. And if you do, you'll weather the storm. And if you don't, you won't. It's a simple kind of either-or scenario. Safety comes not just in hearing, but in listening, but in doing and living. Now, if we kind of take this out by itself and we just look at these words, we might think, okay, all right, so I've got to meet the mark. I've got to hit the checkpoints, the KPIs, tick the boxes, follow the rules, live the way God wants, put into practice what Jesus says in all the little bits, and then I'll be safe. If you think that's what Jesus means by putting into practice what I say, we haven't been listening to what Jesus has been saying in his sermon. I mean, we can't get to this point of the Sermon on the Mount and think Jesus is saying, here's all the rules, tick them all and you'll be okay. No, he's been saying all the way, I don't want your actions. You can't live up to it. I need your heart. I want your heart. I don't want you to live for other things in this world but kind of tick the Jesus boxes. No. You can't live for the other kings. You can't live for money or for reputation or even religiousness. You need to come into my kingdom, see me as Lord, see God as Father. Trust not in the things that are here today and gone tomorrow. Build your life on me. I am the rock. If you truly listen to me and do what I say, you'll be like the wise man who built his house on the rock, the one who withstands the storm. And what he says is, see me as king, live for me as king. Now, these are very famous words, aren't they? The wise man built his house upon the rock. All kinds of, you might have a little tune going through your head at the moment. And it's in the kids' books, it's in the Sunday school lessons, and there's the kind of images that we're kind of used to seeing. Often like the house built in this kind of enormous rock in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's kind of a strange scenario to be building on. But and we hear this story and we kind of chuckle at the foolish man sitting there in the debris of his house. You know, why is he building on a beach? You know, that's ridiculous. It's kind of what we often have in mind. But now when I went to Oman and I went wadi bashing in the valleys there, it gave me a bit of a different way to look at this illustration that Jesus uses, perhaps with slightly more Middle Eastern eyes. Because when we went out to the valley, the other warning they gave us is, you know, if it rains, you need to get out of there. You can't be in there. You shouldn't camp overnight. You can't be there at certain times. It can rain kilometers away and it'll flash flood where you are. You'll be careful. I'll give you an example. So here's a bit of the wadi. It's a bit of a tourist spot on the next slide there, Pascal, thank you. And it looks beautiful. A bit more touristy. It's that little gazebo there built on a rock. And it's lovely. But here's the same spot after some significant rain. Can you see it? You can spot the little gazebo as well. Same spot. I feel like kind of gives a bit more context, don't you think, to this story? This is not just a big storm and whatever. It's the place that looks completely safe and beautiful and fine, taken out by the floods. So when I went out there and I saw these little houses clinging to the sides of the valley, and reflecting on it years later, it makes a bit more sense, doesn't it? I mean, you can choose, right, to build your house down in the nice, sandy, pebbly valley floor, or you can choose to build it up in the rocky slopes. It doesn't seem so dumb to build on the flat. It's far easier. It's much work to get your materials up into the rocky cliffs and to carve out your spot there. And look, it's the desert, right? How often does it rain? Well, once would be too many. I wonder if this is more like the image that Jesus and his hearers thought of when he thought of this image of the sand and the rock and the building. So what do we see? What's the point? And I feel like Jesus is kind of building on the illustrations he had before. It's kind of the same story as the narrow and the wide gate. It's not particularly the easy choice to go with Jesus. It's not the way you kind of drift into. It's not always the easy choice to live with Jesus and to trust in him. Like the whole Sermon on the Mount's been just showing how countercultural it is to live with Jesus as your king than anything else. Success looks different in the kingdom. Blessedness looks different in the kingdom to what we're used to. It's not something we drift towards. It's not the gate that we'll naturally head towards. And if you arrive there in the desert wadi and it's, you want to build there for some reason, sure, like why not build where it's flat? You wouldn't know. There's no problem. The place is dry as a bone. And so you build your house there, right? But then someone comes, knocks on your door and says, you really shouldn't live here, okay? When the rains come, you'll lose your house and maybe your life. And you got to think about their warning. You look outside, there's not a cloud in the sky, and you think, is it really going to rain? You've got a choice. Listen and act, or carry on as before. Stay where you are, and maybe face the storm on your own terms. Hope the house that you've built is strong enough to withstand it. Jesus here, as he comes to his people, as he comes to humanity, he's knocking on the door and bringing a warning. He's revealing again how far humanity is from God. And I think many, they wouldn't have realized it in lots of ways. They think we're doing the religious things, we're ticking the boxes, we're okay. But he shows humanity's hearts far from God. And God, he says, like, if God is the source of life and you reject him, well, then you face it on your own. You face life, you face it on your own without the life that he offers. The foundations that you trust in, well, they're your foundations. And they just might not hold you up. Actually, they won't hold you up. But Jesus doesn't come and use scare tactics and just fear. No, he comes with a solution as well. He comes and says, it's dangerous, but I bring rescue too. There is a gate that leads to life. I am that gate. There is a place of safety in that storm. I am the rock. Don't just listen to my warning. Act on it. Shift your foundations. Build your life on me and on my words. Now, people talk about this story from time to time. It's, like I said, a very famous one of Jesus' little sayings, little stories. You'll hear it said, build your life on Jesus and he'll help you weather the storms of life. As different tricky times hit you, you'll be secure in Jesus. Now, I think that's true. I think that's entirely true. Walking through the valley with Jesus is far, far better than walking through the valley without Jesus. But I think we can minimize the seriousness of what Jesus is talking about here. He's not talking about any storm or any hard time. He's talking life and death. He's talking eternity. He's talking that moment we stand before God and give an account of that day we read about in verse 22 before. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? And he'll tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Look, if there's a storm I want to avoid, that's the storm I want to avoid. If there's a storm that can flatten me for eternity, it's that one. But Jesus says, I can protect you from even that storm. If you listen to me and do what I say, that is, if you trust in me for your safety, if you see me as king, if you live as a child of the kingdom, well, then let me cover you and protect you, and you'll be safe even in that storm. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the narrow gate. I am the rock. Trust in me. Trust in me. Now, I don't know what you think of Jesus. I don't know what you're sitting there thinking about him. I don't know what maybe your friends or others will think about Jesus. And you might think that others might say, well, how can he claim that? How can he claim to be the one way? How can he claim to be the narrow gate, the only safety? And that's exclusive. And the first listeners were kind of dumbfounded too, a little bit. Well, not dumbfounded. They were astonished. They were amazed that they can see something's different here. Matthew 7:28. When Jesus had finished saying these things, keep in mind, it's just been the whole sermon. It's probably been even longer than what we have in our scriptures. But finished saying all these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. they see something in Jesus that is different to what they've ever experienced before. Something different. This teaching sounds different to them. Like their usual teachers, the preachers, the teachers of the law, they would do what I do. They'd point to the scriptures and say, look, Isaiah says this, or whatever says this. They might say, oh, Rabbi so-and-so says this, and I might quote Don Carson, he says this, But Jesus is different. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me. Everyone who hears these words of mine puts them into practice. Imagine if I stood up and started preaching like that, as if I was the way. Like you can, language of I, me, mine. Now it's a Beatles song. Do you want to pick that up? I, me, mine. And you know who wrote it? George Harrison wrote it just before the band broke up about the egos of his bandmates and how everything was going to pieces. John and Paul. I, me, mine, it's all about me. This overblown egos that eventually split him up. Is that what's going on here? Jesus, is Jesus' overblown ego? Me, I. Well, those he was listening to didn't seem to think so. They heard Jesus. And when they saw him, they saw authority. He taught as one with authority. As if he knew what he was talking about, as if he had the right to use this kind of language. Now, if you remember, if you were here when we started in Matthew 6 months ago-ish, we were talking about then how the whole point of what Jesus was doing was what Matthew was doing in this story of Jesus is to establish his authority and kingship. That's why we had the genealogies that show that he's in the line of kings. That's why we had the miraculous birth stories, all the prophecies pointing to Jesus time and time again. That's why we saw him withstand temptation in the desert, call disciples, heal the sick. And if you're still here when we finish Matthew, at this rate, in a few years' time, well, I know, we'll get there. We'll get to the words, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples. It's all about Jesus. It from beginning to end, has this exclusive, this is all about Jesus perspective. What do you make of that? Is he pulling scare tactics to bring people to his movement apart from someone else's? Or is he the emergency services banging on your door saying there's a warning you actually need to hear because you're in danger? What do we do with this Jesus? How do we see him? Hey, people, maybe yourself, maybe others will say, well, sure, look, he's a good teacher. He's got some wise words. He's got some wisdom to share. And look, this Sermon on the Mount is a great ethical document. If we live this way, it'd be so good. People point to this, Christian and non-Christian, as like this kind of high point of moral instruction. And they say, well, look what he's taught. This is just a good, wise, teaching man. And that's it. But I think to say that based on his words is kind of ridiculous. It's even dishonest to say that because Jesus doesn't teach here just some wise sayings. He claims exclusivity. He claims uniqueness. He claims deity. He claims to be God. I heard this quote recently in the Alpha course, which kind of digs into these things a little bit. A quote from C.S. Lewis again. And it reminds us that a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be insane or he would be a devil of hell. He's either deluded or he's out to get you. You must make this choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane or something worse. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. What do you see when you see Jesus and hear his words? Do you see his authority? Strong foundation. Someone worth building your life on. Perhaps we look at Jesus and we go, look, he's onto something. It's not worth getting worried about it at this stage. I can deal with this later. I'm okay for now. Look, building on the rock sounds hard work. I'm okay on the valley floor for now. I'll keep an eye out for the weather. And if I need to move and go to this Jesus thing later, then I can do that. When my time's running out, perhaps. The sun's out. The storms are far off. It doesn't seem worth it to kind of dive in with this Jesus stuff. We hear Jesus warning and say, look, I get it, but it can wait. And that's It's a gamble. Do you want to take that gamble? I was thinking about my trip to Oman, and another memory of that time came back, a much sadder memory. Because I remember that just before going on that trip, I'd heard news that a girl my age who was a neighbour and a friend, her name was Lara, and she'd moved back to South Africa from where we were neighbours. And I wasn't going to see her again, but then I heard this news that she'd been killed in a motor vehicle accident. And it just kind of rocked my world, because I was 10 or 11. This was like kind of the first experience I had of someone dying before their time, someone I knew and cared about. And I think you're reminded you just don't have any control. You don't know. She was on her way to school, I think. Like it was just an ordinary day, and these things happen. It takes just a little moment to look around the news and just realize how little control we have, how soon any of us could face that storm. How much you want to gamble on holding off on finding safety. See, only Jesus offers safety in that storm. And we can have trust in his offer of safety. We can have trust that this offer actually holds water. Holds off water, so to speak. We have trust that this is worth listening to, because Jesus, despite his kind of authoritative teaching and his kingship and his godness, he lowers himself, and then he stands and he faces the storm for us. He faces death head on. The storm breaks its full weight on Jesus. The wall of the flash flood takes him head on. And in the cross, in weakness, it looks like Jesus goes under, right? Looks like the storm takes him out. But it can't hold him. It couldn't hold him then. The streams rose, the wind blew and beat, and Jesus stood firm. And so in him, we can stand firm. That's the only way we can know that's true. Because if it's true for Jesus, then Jesus is the one that can make that true for us. If we don't just, hear his words and keep him at arm's length, if we listen to him, if we trust and live and build our lives on him and in him, that's where we can be safe. That's where we can stand firm, in the small storms and the big storms too. Jesus is that rock. I'm going to pray.